Drowning in the haze of too many margaritas, Emma collapsed into the arms of Vince, her roommate and best friend of 10 years, carrying the crushing weight of the betrayal that had just shattered her world. Tonight was supposed to be the pinnacle of her happiness, their 3-year anniversary, the night she was absolutely certain Kyle would propose after she had bled herself dry working 2 grueling jobs just to fund his MBA. Instead, all she received was a ruthless rejection from the ungrateful man who coldly discarded her with the excuse that he was now successful, living in a different world, and needed to move on to someone worthy of his new status. Just as Emma hit rock bottom, with her ex-boyfriend still shamelessly hurling mocking insults her way, Vince stepped forward and extinguished the bastard's arrogance with a crazy yet violently resolute declaration: "You're my best friend, and this is your last chance. I will marry you." To her absolute shock, Emma woke up the next morning with a cold ring on her finger, realizing she had actually gotten engaged to her best friend. Yet, instead of running away, the two soon found themselves standing before Chicago City Hall, where Emma closed her eyes and signed the marriage certificate, clinging to this insane union as her only lifeline to escape her ruthless mother and brother, who were actively plotting to sell her off to an old billionaire to settle their debts. The heavy wooden doors of the government building closed behind them with a definitive thud. Emma stood on the concrete steps, the chilly Chicago wind whipping through her thin coat. She stared down at the simple silver band resting on her left ring finger. It felt impossibly heavy. Just 24 hours ago, she was a desperate girl bleeding her soul dry for a man who looked at her like dirt. Now, she was a married woman. She glanced up at Vince. He was standing a few steps below her, his broad shoulders blocking the biting wind. For 10 years, he had been the quiet nerd from the IT department, the guy who shared her cramped apartment, ate cheap takeout with her, and listened to her cry. But today, dressed in a crisp black button-down shirt that stretched tight across his chest, there was an imposing aura around him that she had never noticed before. "Get in the car, Emma. You are freezing," Vince said, his voice a low, steady rumble that commanded instant obedience. He opened the passenger door of his modest sedan for her. Slipping into the leather seat, the adrenaline that had fueled her reckless decision finally began to crash. The reality of the situation suffocated her. She had married her best friend to escape the clutches of her gambling, addicted mother and violent brother. What had she done? How could she drag Vince into her messy, broken life? Vince slid into the driver's seat, the engine roaring to life. The drive back to their apartment was draped in a thick, heavy silence. Emma twisted the ring on her finger, her anxiety skyrocketing. She waited for him to show regret, to look at her with the same exhausting pity she always received from others. Instead, when they stopped at a red light, Vince reached over. His large, warm hand enveloped her trembling, icy fingers. The touch sent a strange, electric jolt straight to her chest. "Breathe," he commanded softly. His thumb traced lazy circles over her knuckles. "No one is going to sell you to anyone. You belong to me now, and I protect what is mine." Emma swallowed hard, her heart pounding violently against her ribs. The possessive edge in his words should have scared her. It was entirely out of character for the mild-mannered IT guy she thought she knew. Yet, as she looked into his dark, fathomless eyes, a profound, unshakable sense of safety washed over her. For the first time in 26 years, she did not have to fight alone. She was not a tool to be used or a burden to be discarded. She was protected. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking. "But Vince, my family, they are dangerous. Trevor will not let this go easily. He owes a lot of money to terrible people." "Let me worry about Trevor," Vince replied smoothly, his eyes flashing with a cold, lethal promise that Emma completely missed as he turned his attention back to the road. "You just focus on yourself." As they pulled into the parking lot of their apartment complex, reality crashed back down on Emma. The marriage solved her immediate nightmare with her family, but it created a massive complication for her survival in the corporate world. "Vince, wait," Emma said before he could turn off the ignition. She bit her lower lip, formulating her words. "We need to talk about Obsidian Corporation." Vince paused, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. What about it? We work in the same building. You are in the basement IT department, and I am in marketing. I am fighting for the director position this quarter. If human resources finds out we got married, or worse, if Kyle opens his mouth and twists the story. She took a ragged breath. Kyle is a junior executive now. He will use this to humiliate me. He will tell everyone I married the IT guy out of spite. It could ruin my chances for the promotion. I need that salary, Vince. I needed to pay off the rest of the debts so my family stops coming after me. Vince watched her frantic explanation, his expression completely unreadable. Deep down, the absolute irony of the situation amused him darkly. His brilliant, hard-working wife was terrified of losing a promotion at Obsidian Corp, completely unaware that the man sitting next to her owned the entire corporation and the ground it was built on. He could fire Kyle with a single text message. He could hand her the chief executive officer chair if she wanted it. But Vince knew Emma. She was fiercely independent, driven by a desperate need to prove her own worth after a lifetime of being beaten down. If he revealed his true identity now, the shock would break her fragile trust. She needed to win this battle on her own terms, and he would simply be the invisible hand clearing her path. I understand, Vince said, his tone gentle but firm. He leaned closer, his proximity making her breath hitch. We keep it a secret. At the office, we are just colleagues. I am just the invisible tech guy, and you are the future director of marketing. No one at Obsidian Corp will know you are my wife. Emma exhaled a massive sigh of relief, the tension draining from her stiff shoulders. Thank you, Vince. Seriously, I owe you my life. Vince reached out, tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. His gaze lingered on her lips for a fraction of a second too long before he pulled back. You owe me nothing, Emma. Just remember our deal. Outside that office, you're mine. She nodded, her cheeks flushing a deep crimson. As they walked up the stairs to their shared apartment, Emma felt a strange fluttering in her stomach. She had walked down these stairs this morning as a broken, abandoned girl. She was returning as a married woman. The ring on her finger felt less like a heavy chain and more like an indestructible shield. What she did not know was that this shield was forged in the darkest, most dangerous corners of the underworld, and the man holding it was prepared to burn the entire city to the ground to keep her safe. The neon lights of the Obsidian Corp lobby glared against the sleek marble floors, casting long, sharp shadows that seemed to mirror the heavy dread settling in Emma's stomach. Monday morning felt less like the start of a work week and more like walking into an active war zone. She clutched her lukewarm coffee cup, her knuckles turning white, desperately trying to focus on the marketing proposal that was supposed to secure her promotion to director. She tucked her left hand deep into the pocket of her tailored slacks, hiding the simple silver wedding band from the prying eyes of the corporate world. She just needed to keep her head down. If she could just survive the quarter, the promotion would be hers, and she could finally breathe. But the universe had a cruel sense of humor. Just as Emma settled into her cubicle, the crisp, unmistakable sound of expensive leather shoes echoed across the open floor plan. A sudden hush fell over the marketing department. Emma froze. She did not even need to look up to know who it was. Kyle Preston strutted into the room like he owned the entire building. He was wearing a custom navy suit, the exact suit Emma had worked an extra month of night shifts at a diner to buy for his graduation. Now he was wearing it to parade his new junior executive status. His hair was perfectly styled, and a smug, predatory smirk played on his lips as his eyes locked onto her desk. Well, Kyle announced, his voice carrying effortlessly across the silent room. Colleagues peeked over their monitors, smelling the fresh blood in the water. If it is not the most desperate woman in Chicago. Emma kept her eyes glued to her screen, her jaw clenched so tight her teeth ached. I am working, Kyle. Please leave my desk. Kyle let out a sharp, mocking laugh. He leaned casually against her cubicle wall, crossing his arms. Working hard to support another loser, Emma? I heard the rumors, but I honestly did not believe you could sink that low. He turned his head, addressing the eavesdropping coworkers with theatrical pity. Did you all hear the news? Our dedicated Emma here got dumped on Friday, and by Saturday morning, she was so terrified of dying alone that she dragged that pathetic, four-eyed IT guy from the basement to the courthouse. A few muffled snickers erupted from the nearby desks. The heat of total humiliation flooded Emma's cheeks, burning all the way to the tips of her ears. Kyle was intentionally destroying her professional reputation, painting her as a hysterical, emotionally unstable wreck right when the director position was on the line. "Vince is 10 times the man you will ever be," Emma fired back, her voice shaking despite her best efforts to keep it steady. "Now get out of my department." "Vince is a nobody," Kyle sneered, leaning in close so only she could smell his expensive cologne. "He fixes jammed printers for a living. You went from funding a future CEO to sleeping with a glorified mechanic. Enjoy your miserable, poverty-stricken life, Emma." 10 floors above them, hidden behind reinforced steel doors in the restricted executive penthouse, Vincent Salvatore sat in total darkness. The only light in the cavernous room came from a massive wall of security monitors. He was not in the basement. He never was. Vince watched the feed from the marketing department with eyes as cold and dead as a winter grave. He zoomed in on Kyle's smug face, then shifted the camera angle to capture Emma. He saw her trembling shoulders. He saw the sheer embarrassment crushing her spirit. A low, dangerous growl vibrated in Vince's chest. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the mahogany desk, his large hands steepled together. In the criminal underworld, men had been tortured for weeks just for speaking his name without permission. Now, this arrogant parasite was standing in Vince's own building, breathing Vince's air and emotionally terrorizing Vince's wife. Kyle wanted to play the powerful executive. Vince was going to show him what absolute, terrifying power actually looked like. Without breaking eye contact with Kyle's image on the screen, Vince reached for his encrypted keyboard. He bypassed the human resources protocols entirely, hacking straight into the central building security mainframe. His fingers moved with lethal precision. First, he terminated Kyle's employee status. Second, he wiped all data from Kyle's corporate mobile device. Third, he flagged Kyle's biometric ID as a level 1 security threat. Back in the marketing department, Kyle was still basking in the glow of his own cruelty. "You see, Emma, in this world, there are winners, and there are people like you and your little tech support husband. You are just stepping stones." Suddenly, the sleek corporate phone in Kyle's hand emitted a shrill, continuous beep. The screen flashed bright red before going completely black. Kyle frowned, tapping the screen aggressively. What the hell? Before he could figure out why his phone was dead, the elevator doors at the end of the hall dinged open. For towering security guards, clad in tactical black uniforms, marched onto the floor in perfect unison. Their expressions were grim, their hands resting cautiously near their utility belts. They bypassed the receptionist and headed straight for Emma's cubicle. Kyle scoffed, trying to regain his composure. Finally, "Hey, guards, you need to clear out this area. I am conducting an executive review." The lead guard did not even blink. He stepped right into Kyle's personal space, towering over the junior executive. "Kyle Preston, your security clearance has been revoked effective immediately. Hand over your identification badge and surrender any company property." The entire department gasped in collective shock. Emma stared wide-eyed, her hands hovering frozen over her keyboard. "Excuse me," Kyle sputtered, his smug facade shattering into a million pieces. His face turned a splotchy, ugly shade of red. "Do you know who I am? I am a junior executive. I report directly to the vice president. You cannot do this." "Your badge, Mr. Preston," the guard repeated, his voice booming with zero tolerance. "Or we will remove it for you. This is a mistake. A system error." Kyle yelled, panic finally bleeding into his voice as he frantically looked around at the coworkers who were now staring at him with a mixture of shock and suppressed amusement. He patted his pockets, pulling out his ID lanyard. The small green light on the plastic card flickered and died, turning a permanent, unforgiving red. "Escort him out," the lead guard commanded. 2 massive guards grabbed Kyle by his upper arms. The expensive suit wrinkled instantly under their iron grips. Kyle struggled, his polished leather shoes slipping awkwardly on the marble floor. "Get your hands off me. I will sue this entire company. I will have your jobs." Kyle screamed, his voice cracking hysterically as he was dragged backward down the main aisle. The spectacle was absolute. The man who had walked in like a king was being thrown out like common trash. Emma watched him flail and curse as the elevator doors closed on his red, furious face, severing his shouting from the quiet office. A heavy, stunned silence blanketed the marketing floor. No one moved. No one spoke. Emma sat back in her chair, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked down at her computer screen, her mind racing. Kyle was gone. Just like that. Her biggest obstacle, her worst tormentor, had been humiliated and erased from the company in less than 3 minutes. She felt a strange, thrilling wave of vindication wash over her. She looked around the empty space where Kyle had stood just moments ago. It felt like a miracle. It felt like an invisible guardian angel had descended from the ceiling to strike down her enemy. Up in the dark executive suite, Vince finally leaned back in his leather chair, a dark, satisfied smile curving his lips. He watched Emma let out a long, shuddering breath of relief on the monitor. He traced her digital image on the screen with his index finger. She thought she was fighting alone in a cutthroat corporate world. She had no idea that the man she married rolled the shadows, and he would gladly burn the entire city to ash just to see her smile. The lingering high from surviving the corporate bloodbath at Obsidian Corp evaporated the second Emma stepped off the bus near her neighborhood. The Chicago evening was brutally cold, but it was nothing compared to the icy dread pulling in her stomach as she approached her apartment building. She prayed for a quiet night. She just wanted to sit in the cramped kitchen with Vince, eat cheap noodles, and pretend the world outside their door did not exist. When she unlocked the flimsy wooden door, the smell of simmering garlic and tomatoes greeted her. Vince was standing by the stove, stirring a pot of pasta sauce. He wore a simple gray t-shirt that stretched over his broad back, looking like the epitome of domestic tranquility. He glanced over his shoulder, his dark eyes softening instantly at the sight of her. For a fleeting second, Emma felt a profound wave of peace. She had a husband. She had a home. That fragile illusion shattered into a million pieces before she could even take off her coat. A violent, rhythmic pounding shook the front door, rattling the cheap brass hinges. It was not a polite knock. It was the aggressive, entitled hammering of people who believed they owned whoever was on the other side. Emma froze, her heart plummeting straight into her shoes. She recognized that knock. Before she could take a step toward the peephole, the door was kicked open with a deafening crack, the deadbolt splintering the door frame. Her mother, Martha, marched into the living room, bringing the bitter stench of cheap gin and stale cigarette smoke with her. Right on Martha's heels was Trevor, Emma's older brother. His massive frame practically filled the entryway, his knuckles heavily scarred from years of bar fights, and his bloodshot eyes darting wildly around the small room. "You ungrateful little bitch," Martha screeched, her shrill voice slicing through the quiet apartment like a rusty blade. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at Emma. "You did not show up at the restaurant yesterday. Mr. Vance waited for 2 hours. 2 hours, Emma. Do you have any idea what you have done? He was going to give us $50,000 to settle our debts." Emma backed away, her hands shaking as she bumped into the edge of the sofa. "I told you I was not going to let you sell me to some old billionaire, Mom. I am not a piece of property." Trevor stepped forward, his heavy boots thudding against the cheap linoleum floor. His aggressive gaze raked over Emma, looking for any sign of weakness. As Emma crossed her arms defensively over her chest, the overhead light caught the glint of the simple silver band on her left ring finger. Trevor stopped dead in his tracks. A sickening realization contorted his brutal features. "Are you kidding me?" Trevor roared, his voice shaking the thin walls of the apartment. He pointed a thick finger at her hand. "You got married? You secretly married this pathetic basement rat." He turned his furious glare toward Vince, who had stopped stirring the sauce, but remained completely motionless by the stove. "You just cost us our entire payout to play house with a tech geek." "It is none of your business, Trevor," Emma yelled back, a desperate edge of panic bleeding into her voice. "Get out of my home." Trevor sneered, a vicious, ugly sound that made Emma's blood run cold. "Your home? I will show you what happens when you mess with my money. You owe us your life." Trevor lunged forward with terrifying speed, raising his heavy, clenched fist to strike her right across the face. Emma squeezed her eyes shut, raising her arms to brace for the crushing impact she had endured so many times before in her childhood. She braced for the pain, the blood, the inevitable darkness. The impact never came. Instead, a sickening crunch echoed through the small apartment, followed immediately by a guttural howl of absolute agony from Trevor. Emma opened her eyes, gasping for air. Vince was no longer standing in the kitchen. He had crossed the room with a predatory, blinding speed that her eyes could not even comprehend. He was now standing firmly between her and her brother, an immovable shield of solid muscle. Vince had caught Trevor by his thick wrist in midair. The mild-mannered IT guy was gone. In his place stood a monster forged in the pitch-black depths of the underworld. Vince did not shout. He did not look angry or out of control. His face was a mask of cold, terrifying indifference. With a simple, fluid twist of his own wrist, Vince applied an impossible amount of calculated pressure. Bone snapped cleanly under his grip. Trevor dropped to his knees, screaming hysterically as his right arm bent at a grotesque, unnatural angle. Not a single drop of blood was spilled, but the sheer clinical brutality of the execution was paralyzing. "Do not ever raise your hand at my wife," Vince whispered. His voice was barely above a breath, yet it carried the chilling, inescapable weight of a loaded gun pressed to the temple. Martha stood completely frozen in horror, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. She looked at her violent son writhing on the floor in a puddle of his own tears, then looked up at the quiet roommate she had always openly mocked. The sheer, suffocating aura of lethal authority radiating from Vince made her knees buckle. Vince calmly released Trevor, letting the massive man crumple onto the floor. He reached into the back pocket of his dark jeans and pulled out a thick, heavy brick of crisp $100 bills. It was dirty money, washed clean through the Salvatore Syndicate, amounting to exactly $50,000. Vince tossed the brick of cash onto the floor. It hit the cheap linoleum with a heavy thud, landing right next to Martha's boots. "Take it," Vince commanded, his obsidian eyes locking onto Martha's terrified face with the intensity of a predator eyeing its prey. "Consider it payment in full for her life. But hear me very clearly, Martha. If you or this pathetic excuse for a man ever come within 100 feet of Emma again, I will not just break his other arm. I will erase both of your existences from this earth so thoroughly that not even the devil will be able to find your bones." The absolute, terrifying certainty in his voice left no room for negotiation or doubt. This was not a warning from an angry boyfriend. It was an executioner dictating his final terms. Martha scrambled to her knees, frantically clutching the stack of cash to her chest with greedy, shaking hands. "Come on, Trevor, get up. Get up right now," she hissed, grabbing her sobbing son by his good shoulder and pulling him frantically toward the door. Trevor stumbled to his feet, cradling his shattered arm against his chest. His face was pale and slick with a cold sweat. He did not dare look Vince in the eye. Like beaten, terrified dogs, the two of them scrambled out the broken doorway, stumbling down the hallway and disappearing into the night without a single word of protest. Silence rushed back into the apartment, thick and suffocating. Emma stood completely frozen by the sofa, her breathing shallow and erratic. She stared at the empty doorway, her mind violently struggling to process the explosive scene she had just witnessed. The precise, merciless way Vince had shattered a man's bone without batting an eyelash was not something a tech support worker could do. It was the work of a seasoned killer. The heavy silence in the apartment pressed against Emma like a physical weight. She remained frozen by the edge of the sofa, her breathing shallow and frantic. Her wide eyes were fixed on the splintered doorway where her nightmares had just fled. Her mind violently replayed the sickening crack of Trevor's bone and the terrifying, deadpan look in Vince's eyes. That was not the clumsy guy who struggled to open jars of pickles. That was a predator. Vince turned around slowly. The lethal, freezing aura that had just filled the room dissipated in an instant, replaced by a suffocating, heavy wave of concern. He walked toward her, his footsteps making no sound on the cheap linoleum floor. "Emma," he murmured softly. She flinched instinctively, her shoulders drawing up to her ears. When she had backed away from Trevor, she had scraped her arm violently against the sharp, exposed metal hinge of the old sofa. A thin line of blood was slowly trailing down her pale forearm, stinging sharply. Then stopped in his tracks, his dark eyes snapping down to the blood. A new, terrifying shadow crossed his face, but he forced it down, taking a slow, measured breath. "You are bleeding. Let me look at that." Without waiting for an answer, he stepped into the bathroom to retrieve their small medical box. The apartment was stiflingly hot, the residual adrenaline making the air feel thick and unbreathable. When Vince stepped back into the living room, he pulled his gray shirt over his head in one fluid motion, tossing the fabric onto a nearby chair to keep it from getting stained with antiseptic. Emma looked up, and the breath completely vanished from her lungs. For 10 years, she had lived with him. She thought she knew every mundane detail about Vincent. But as he stood under the harsh glare of the overhead light, she realized she knew absolutely nothing. His back was a canvas of violence. Thick, jagged scars crisscrossed over his heavily muscled shoulders. Two distinct, circular burn marks that looked horrifyingly like old bullet wounds marred his lower torso. But it was the massive, intricate ink sprawling across his entire back that made her blood run cold. It was a sprawling, Gothic crest featuring a crown intertwined with thorns and 2 crossed sides. Emma had seen that exact crest before in passing news reports about the criminal underworld. It was the absolute, unquestionable mark of the Salvatore Syndicate, the most ruthless crime family on the entire East Coast. Before she could process the horrifying discovery, Vince turned around. He knelt in front of her, the medical box resting on his knee. He did not notice her staring at his back. All of his attention was completely focused on the small, insignificant cut on her arm. He took a cotton swab, soaking it in cleaning solution. "This might sting a little," he warned gently. His large, calloused hands enveloped her wrist. The touch was impossibly light, reverent even, as if he were handling the most fragile piece of glass in the world. He carefully cleaned the blood away, blowing cool air over the sting. Emma looked down at the top of his head, her heart hammering a chaotic rhythm against her ribs. The contrast was dizzying. The same hands that had just snapped a huge man in half without a second thought were now treating her tiny scrape with agonizing tenderness. "I am sorry they got in," Vince said quietly, securing a pristine white bandage over the cut. He tilted his head up, his pitch black eyes meeting hers. "I promise you, Emma, you will never have to look at them again. They are ghosts to us now." Emma swallowed the lump forming in her throat. She looked at his broad chest, tracing the outline of his muscular frame, and then back up to his eyes. A fierce, consuming warmth blossomed low in her stomach. It was an intense, undeniable attraction that terrified her. She was undeniably drawn to the dark, possessive danger radiating from him. He had claimed her, protected her, and bought her freedom with $50,000 he had casually pulled from his pocket. "Who are you, Vince?" she whispered, the question slipping past her lips before she could stop it. Vince froze, his thumb pausing its gentle caress over her knuckles. He searched her eyes, seeing the raw vulnerability and the flickering spark of doubt hiding behind her gratitude. He leaned in closer, his face mere inches from hers. The scent of dark cedar and something deeply metallic wrapped around her senses. "I am your husband," he replied, his voice a low, gravelly vow that seemed to echo in the hollow of her bones. "I am the man who will burn the world to keep you safe. That is the only truth you ever need to know." He pressed a soft, lingering kiss to the inside of her wrist, right over her racing pulse. Emma closed her eyes, a shiver running down her spine. The touch ignited a fire in her veins, completely overriding her logic. She was sharing a bed with a ghost, a man who wore the scars of a war zone and the mark of the Mafia. The realization planted a deep, terrifying seed of doubt in her mind, but as his strong arms wrapped around her waist to pull her into a comforting embrace, she found herself completely unwilling to pull away. She was trapped in his beautiful, dangerous darkness, and heaven help her, she wanted to stay. The fragile peace inside their apartment lasted exactly 48 hours before the real world violently breached their sanctuary once again. Emma tried to bury the terrifying revelation of the Salvatore Syndicate crest deep in the back of her mind. She threw herself entirely into her work at Obsidian Corp, desperate to secure the director of marketing promotion. It was her only ticket to true independence. But a new storm was brewing, one that wore designer heels and dripped with venomous entitlement. On Wednesday morning, the glass doors of the Obsidian Corp lobby slid open to admit a hurricane of high society arrogance. Victoria Vance, the publicly recognized heiress of the Vance family, strode into the building like a queen inspecting her subjects. Freshly returned from a luxury tour of Europe, Victoria was armed with a massive diamond ring and an incredibly loud voice. She marched straight to the reception desk, demanding immediate access to the top floor. She loudly proclaimed to anyone within earshot that she was the arranged fiancée of the mysterious chief executive officer, here to officially secure their corporate merger and impending nuptials. The receptionist, terrified by the screaming heiress, frantically tried to explain that the chief executive officer was strictly unavailable and took no unannounced meetings. Furious at the public rejection, Victoria stormed away from the desk, deciding to parade her power through the lower floors instead. Her march of dominance led her directly through the marketing department. That was when her sharp, predatory eyes caught something that made her blood boil. Standing by a modest cubicle was Vincent Salvatore. Victoria knew exactly who he was. Their mafia-affiliated families had been subtly trying to arrange a marriage between them for years. Yet, the ruthless, terrifying heir to the Salvatore empire was currently wearing a cheap polo shirt and thick-rimmed glasses, leaning casually against a desk and handing a cup of coffee to a pale, exhausted-looking girl. Victoria stopped dead in her tracks, hiding behind a frosted glass partition. She watched in absolute disbelief as the most feared man on the East Coast gently tucked a strand of hair behind the pathetic marketing assistant's ear. The sheer, unadulterated jealousy that ripped through Victoria was blinding. Her supposed fiancé, a billionaire and a lethal underworld king, was degrading himself by playing the role of a lowly tech support worker just to court some nameless, poverty-stricken peasant. Unable to contain her rage, but smart enough not to confront Vincent Salvatore in public, Victoria spun on her heel and exited the building. She needed to destroy the girl. She needed to humiliate the peasant so thoroughly that Vincent would drop his ridiculous disguise and return to his rightful place at the top of the food chain. Fate handed Victoria the perfect weapon just across the street. Kyle Preston was sitting in a dimly lit cafe directly opposite Obsidian Corporation. Ever since his humiliating termination, he had been obsessively watching the building, stewing in a toxic mixture of hatred and wounded pride. When he saw the famous Victoria Vance storm out of the corporate headquarters looking absolutely murderous, a wicked idea sparked in his desperate mind. Kyle abandoned his lukewarm coffee and intercepted the heiress before she could reach her chauffeured car. He introduced himself smoothly, playing the role of a wronged executive. It took less than 5 minutes of conversation for them to realize they shared a common, despised enemy. Her name is Emma, Kyle sneered, his eyes gleaming with malicious intent as they sat in the back of Victoria's heavily tinted luxury vehicle. She is a manipulative little gold digger. She used me to pay for her life, then dumped me to marry that pathetic tech guy. Now she is trying to steal the director position. Victoria smiled, a cold, reptilian curving of her lips. She did not bother correcting Kyle about the true identity of the man in the basement. Let the fool believe what he wanted. I want her gone, Victoria commanded smoothly. Not just fired. I want her utterly ruined. I want her facing federal charges so she never shows her face in polite society again. Kyle eagerly leaned forward, smelling an opportunity to reclaim his lost power. As a former junior executive, I still have backdoor access to the marketing department server. It is a flaw in the system they have not patched yet. If you can provide me with a dummy account and some offshore financial routing numbers, I can plant a trail of evidence directly on Emma's computer. We will make it look like she is selling highly confidential corporate data to rival companies. Do it, Victoria hissed, pulling a sleek tablet from her designer bag and authorizing a massive transfer of untraceable funds to finance the operation. Make it airtight. By tomorrow afternoon, I want her escorted out of that building in handcuffs. The trap was set with terrifying efficiency. The very next afternoon, Emma was finalizing the last slides of her promotion presentation. Her heart was light, and she was actually looking forward to going home to Vince. But her brief moment of peace shattered when the blaring sound of the corporate security alarm echoed through the marketing floor. For armed security personnel, accompanied by the head of the legal department, marched straight to her desk. The entire office fell dead silent, all eyes fixed on the unfolding drama. Emma Hayes, the legal director, announced loudly, his voice completely devoid of any sympathy. "Step away from your computer. You are under immediate investigation for corporate espionage, data theft, and federal fraud. Security, confiscate her hard drive and restrict her hands." Emma gasped, her blood running completely cold. She stared at the security guards as they closed in around her, the nightmare swallowing her whole. Across the street, Carl was watching through the glass doors of the lobby, a sickeningly triumphant smile plastered across his face, completely unaware that he had just signed his own death warrant by waking a sleeping dragon. The cold metal of the handcuffs hovered inches from Emma's wrists. Panic, raw and suffocating, clawed at her throat. She looked frantically around the marketing department. The faces of her colleagues were a blur of shock and malicious curiosity. The legal director stood before her with an expression of absolute stone, holding a thick folder of fabricated evidence. "I did not do this," Emma pleaded, her voice cracking as a security guard grabbed her upper arm. "I swear to you, I have no idea what those files are. Someone is setting me up." "Save it for the federal investigators, Miss Hayes," the legal director replied coldly. "The digital footprint traces directly back to your personal workstation. You transferred highly classified financial records to an offshore account at 3 o'clock this morning." Across the street, Carl stood grinning behind the glass wall of the cafe. He took a slow sip of his iced coffee, savoring the absolute destruction of the woman who had dared to reject him. A few blocks away, sitting in the plush leather backseat of her chauffeured limousine, Victoria Vance checked her diamond-studded watch. She smiled, fully expecting to see the pathetic marketing assistant dragged out of the building in tears at any moment. Deep in the restricted sub-basement of Obsidian Corp., Vincent Salvatore sat bathed in the blue glow of a dozen massive monitors. His jaw was clenched so tightly a muscle ticked violently in his cheek. They had dared to touch her. They had actually dared to lay a trap for his wife inside his own empire. Vince cracked his knuckles. His fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard with a blinding, lethal speed. He was not just the head of the Salvatore Syndicate. He was a master architect of digital warfare. Finding Kyle's clumsy backdoor access had taken him less than 10 seconds. Tracing the offshore accounts back to Victoria Personal Trust Fund took another 30. He decided a quiet resolution was not enough. He wanted blood. He wanted public, undeniable annihilation. Back on the marketing floor, the security guard stepped forward to lock the steel cuffs around Emma's wrists. Suddenly, every single computer monitor in the massive room went pitch black. The overhead fluorescent lights flickered violently. The giant digital presentation screens mounted on the walls emitted a sharp, high-pitched electronic screech that made everyone cover their ears. Then, the screens flared back to life. The legal director froze. Emma gasped, taking a step back as her own computer monitor displayed a crystal-clear, high-definition video. It was not just on her screen. The feed was broadcasting to every single device in the entire Obsidian Corp skyscraper, including the massive digital billboard in the main lobby. The video showed Kyle sitting in the dimly lit cafe just an hour prior, frantically typing on a stolen laptop. A scrolling box of text appeared next to his face, documenting his exact keystrokes as he illegally bypassed the corporate firewall using his old junior executive credentials. Before the stunned office could even process the visual, an audio recording began to play at maximum volume through the ceiling speakers. It was a flawless, intercepted recording from the interior of Victoria luxury vehicle. "I want her gone," Victoria haughty, venomous voice echoed through the silent marketing department. "Not just fired. I want her utterly ruined. I want her facing federal charges so she never shows her face in polite society again." Then came Kyle's eager, desperate reply. "If you can provide me with a dummy account and some offshore financial routing numbers, I can plant a trail of evidence directly on Emma's computer. We will make it look like she is selling highly confidential corporate data." The entire floor descended into a state of absolute shock. The legal director dropped the folder of fabricated evidence. The papers scattered across the marble floor like dead leaves. At that exact moment, the private cellular phone inside the legal director pocket began to ring. It was a specialized ringtone, one that had never actually sounded before. It was the direct, encrypted emergency line from the chief executive officer. The legal director's hands shook violently as he pulled the phone out and pressed it to his ear. The voice on the other end was distorted, mechanically altered to hide its true tone, but it carried the chilling, absolute authority of a god. "Release her immediately," the voice commanded. "The evidence is a fabrication. The perpetrators are Kyle Preston and Victoria Vance. You will dispatch building security to detain Preston at the cafe across the street, and you will forward all intercepted data to the federal authorities. Do it now." The call disconnected. The legal director swallowed hard, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. He turned to the security guards. "Release Miss Hayes. Right now. Take a team across the street and apprehend Kyle Preston. Detain him until the police arrive." The guards immediately stepped away from Emma, rushing toward the elevators. Outside, Kyle Victoria's smile vanished the second he saw 4 massive security guards sprinting across the street toward the cafe. He tried to run, but they tackled him to the pavement, pinning his face to the dirty concrete just as police sirens began to wail in the distance. Inside the office, the legal director turned back to Emma. His cold, accusatory demeanor had completely vanished, replaced by an expression of profound, trembling respect. He cleared his throat, addressing the entire silent room. By direct order of the chief executive officer, the legal director announced, his voice carrying a slight tremor. "Emma Hayes has been completely exonerated of all false charges. Furthermore, in recognition of her outstanding performance and the unacceptable distress she has endured today, the chief executive officer has officially promoted Miss Hayes to the position of director of marketing, effective immediately." A collective gasp rippled through the cubicles. Emma stood completely frozen, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. She looked at the blank computer screens, then down at her trembling hands. She was not going to prison. She was the new director. Her gaze slowly drifted toward the elevators that led down to the basement. She thought of her quiet, unassuming husband, the man who had promised to protect her. The impossible speed of the digital rescue, the flawless execution, the sheer godlike power required to hijack an entire corporate skyscraper. Vince was not just an IT worker. And as Emma stared at the silver ring on her finger, a thrilling, terrifying realization finally began to take root in her mind. Her husband held the entire world in the palm of his hand, and he was crushing it to pieces just to keep her safe. The humiliation was absolute and entirely unacceptable. Victoria Vance paced the length of her opulent penthouse suite, her expensive stiletto heels sinking into the plush carpets. Kyle Preston had been arrested. Her carefully constructed trap had been violently dismantled in front of the entire corporate world. Though her high-priced lawyers had managed to keep her name out of the official federal indictment by shifting the entirety of the blame onto Kyle, the sting of defeat burned like acid in her veins. She poured herself a glass of amber liquid, her hands trembling with a toxic mixture of rage and wounded pride. Someone inside Obsidian Corp with godlike system access was protecting Emma Hayes. Victoria decided to stop playing corporate games. If the digital world was guarded, she would drag Emma into the physical underworld, a place where money bought absolute silence. Opening her secure laptop, Victoria transferred $500,000 to an encrypted account belonging to a ruthless syndicate of human traffickers operating on the docks. Their instructions were simple and chillingly precise. They were to abduct Emma, place her on an untraceable cargo ship bound for a lawless foreign port, and ensure she never stepped foot on American soil again. But extracting the new director of marketing from the heavily guarded Obsidian Corp skyscraper was impossible. Victoria needed bait. She needed the one weakness Emma still possessed. Martha Hayes sat in a dingy underground gambling parlor, her hands shaking as she stared at the terrifying men surrounding her table. A towering enforcer in a leather jacket slammed a burner phone down in front of her. The message from his wealthy employer was clear. Martha owed the local loan sharks $40,000, a debt that would cost her life by midnight. The enforcer offered to clear the debt completely, but only if Martha made one simple phone call to her estranged daughter. Emma was sitting at her new, expansive mahogany desk, still reeling from the explosive events of the previous day. The director title felt surreal, but the lingering anxiety in her chest refused to dissipate. When her personal cell phone vibrated with an unknown number, she hesitated before answering. "Emma, please do not hang up," Martha sobbed through the crackling speaker. The sheer terror in her mother's voice was raw and undeniable. "I told you never to call me again," Emma said, her voice dropping to a cautious whisper. I know," Martha cried hysterically. "But I am leaving Chicago. Trevor and I are running away. Those men are going to kill us, Emma. I am at the old abandoned textile warehouse near the industrial district. I only called because I have your grandmother's silver locket, the one with her picture. I tried to pawn it, but I could not do it. It is the only good thing left. Please, Emma, come get it before I leave forever. I will wait outside for 10 minutes. If you do not come, I am throwing it in the river." Emma squeezed her eyes shut. That locket was the only physical memory she had of the one person who had ever truly loved her as a child. She knew her mother was a manipulative liar, but the desperate panic in the woman's voice felt terrifyingly real. It was broad daylight, and the warehouse was only a 15-minute drive from the office. She could just grab the locket and leave. The industrial district was a desolate wasteland of rusting metal and shattered glass. Emma parked her car a safe distance away and walked cautiously toward the looming, dilapidated textile warehouse. The freezing wind howled through the broken windows. She kept her hand firmly inside her coat pocket, clutching her keys. "Mom?" Emma called out, her voice echoing in the empty, decaying courtyard. Martha stepped out from the shadows of a rusted shipping container. She looked pale, her eyes darting nervously around the empty lot. She clutched a small velvet pouch in her trembling hands. "Give it to me, and I will leave," Emma demanded, stopping 10 feet away. Martha took a hesitant step forward, tears streaming down her face. "I am so sorry, Emma. I had no choice. They said they would kill me." Before Emma could process the terrifying apology, the heavy metal doors of the shipping container slammed open. 3 massive men dressed in dark tactical gear surged forward with terrifying speed. Emma turned to run, her heart exploding in her chest, but a 4th man dropped down from a rusted fire escape right in her path. She opened her mouth to scream, but a thick cloth soaked in a sickeningly sweet chemical was clamped violently over her face. Emma thrashed wildly, kicking and scratching at the tree trunk arms wrapping around her waist. The heavy scent of chloroform flooded her lungs, burning her throat. "Hold her still," a rough voice growled. "The ship leaves in 1 hour. We need her in the crate before the docks get crowded." The edges of her vision began to blur into a rapid, terrifying darkness. She tried to think of Vince, her desperate mind screaming his name, but her limbs went numb. She realized too late that she had walked blindly into an abyss, and as her body went completely limp, the world dissolved into total blackness. Deep within the fortified sub-basement of Obsidian Corp, Vincent Salvatore was analyzing a complex string of code when a piercing crimson light flashed across his primary monitor. It was followed by a sharp, high-pitched siren that only he could hear through his encrypted earpiece. His fingers froze over the keyboard. The alert was tied to a microscopic global positioning transmitter he had personally embedded deep within the silver band of Emma's wedding ring. The signal was designed to remain dormant unless her pulse dropped to a dangerously low resting rate combined with rapid, unscheduled geographic movement. The telemetry data flooded his screen in a relentless cascade of red text. Her heart rate was sluggish, perfectly mimicking the biological effects of heavy sedation. Her location was moving rapidly away from the abandoned textile district and heading directly toward the eastern shipping ports. Vince stared at the blinking red dot. For 3 excruciating seconds, the entire room was dead silent. Then, the mild-mannered information technology technician completely ceased to exist. In his place, the ruthless head of the Salvatore Syndicate awakened, and hell followed immediately behind him. Vince stood up, his chair crashing violently to the concrete floor. He tapped the communication device in his ear, connecting directly to the central command of his underground empire. "Code Black," Vince stated. His voice was completely devoid of any human emotion. It was a flat, terrifying void that sent shivers down the spines of his most hardened enforcers. "They took my wife. Mobilize every single unit in the city. I want the eastern docks locked down. Nothing moves. Nothing sails. If a single boat leaves the harbor, I will personally execute the harbor master and burn the port to the ground." The response was instantaneous. Across the sprawling city of Chicago, the Salvatore Syndicate sprang into violent action. Hidden garages beneath luxury hotels and abandoned warehouses opened simultaneously. Fleets of heavily armored, not black sport utility vehicles poured into the streets, ignoring all traffic laws. Dozens of heavily armed men, clad in dark tactical gear and carrying military-grade weaponry, abandoned their civilian covers. The Shadow Army was marching, completely bypassing local law enforcement, driven by the absolute, unyielding wrath of their boss. Vince walked to a reinforced steel vault at the back of the server room. He pressed his palm against the biometric scanner. The heavy door hissed open, revealing an arsenal of lethal weaponry. He stripped off his gray polo shirt and discarded his thick-rimmed glasses, leaving the pathetic corporate disguise discarded on the floor like dead skin. He strapped a custom-fitted Kevlar vest tightly over his chest, followed by a black tactical jacket. He loaded 2 heavy-caliber handguns with armor-piercing bullets, securing them in his shoulder holsters. Finally, he grabbed a compact assault rifle and extra magazines. He bypassed the standard elevators, taking a private express chute directly to the underground executive garage. A heavily modified, armor-plated vehicle was already waiting, its massive engine roaring like a caged beast. 3 of his top lieutenants were waiting by the open doors, their faces incredibly grim. They had served the Salvatore family for decades, yet they had never seen their boss in this state of quiet, apocalyptic fury. Vince did not speak a single word as he slid into the driver's seat. He slammed his foot on the gas pedal, tearing out of the garage and launching the heavy vehicle onto the chaotic city streets. The drive to the docks was a terrifying blur of screeching tires and blaring horns. Vince expertly wove the massive vehicle through the heavy afternoon traffic, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth threatened to crack under the pressure. The digital tracker mounted on his dashboard showed Emma was now completely stationary at Pier 42. A cold, suffocating terror mixed with a blinding, volcanic rage deep in his chest. He had promised to protect her. He had looked into her eyes and vowed that no one would ever hurt her again. Someone had dared to cross that line. They had dared to touch the only source of light in his pitch-black world. He was going to make the perpetrators beg for the sweet release of death long before he allowed their hearts to stop beating. The convoy of black vehicles descended upon the eastern shipping ports like a plague of deadly locusts. Dock workers and civilian sailors scattered in absolute terror as heavily armed men poured out of the vehicles. The syndicate soldiers immediately blocked every exit, secured the outer perimeter, and severed all communication lines to the outside world. They seized control of the control tower, forcing the port authorities to drop the heavy barricades on all outbound cargo ships at gunpoint. Vince stepped out of his vehicle into the freezing coastal wind. The air smelled of bitter salt and rusting metal. He racked the bolt of his assault rifle, the sharp metallic clack echoing loudly across the sudden, terrifying silence of the pier. He looked up at the massive, rusting cargo ship docked at the very end of Pier 42. The tracker indicated his wife was trapped somewhere inside the maze of steel shipping containers waiting to be loaded by the massive cranes. Vince raised his left hand, signaling his heavily armed men to advance forward. There would be absolutely no negotiations today. There would be no demands for a ransom. The tyrant of the underworld had arrived to reclaim his queen, and the concrete docks were about to run red with the blood of anyone foolish enough to stand in his path. The heavy steel doors of the targeted shipping container were welded shut, guarded by 4 heavily armed mercenaries who had no idea they were about to face the wrath of the Salvatore Syndicate. Vince did not wait for his men to move into position. He raised his assault rifle and unleashed a relentless storm of armor-piercing rounds. The deafening roar of gunfire shattered the freezing coastal air. The mercenaries fell before they could even unholster their weapons, their bodies collapsing onto the wet concrete in a gruesome display of absolute destruction. Vince moved forward with the terrifying grace of an apex predator. 2 more traffickers emerged from behind a rusted crane, shouting wildly as they aimed their shotguns. Vince did not even blink. He dropped his rifle to its sling, drew both heavy handguns from his shoulder holsters, and fired with lethal, impossible precision. The 2 men dropped instantly, their lives extinguished in a fraction of a second. The concrete pier quickly became a slaughterhouse, a graveyard for anyone who had dared to participate in the abduction of the Syndicate Queen. The remaining Syndicate soldiers secured the perimeter, ensuring not a single enemy was left breathing. Silence fell over Pier 42, broken only by the sound of the crashing waves and the heavy, ragged breathing of the underworld king. Vince holstered his weapons and walked toward the sealed shipping container. His tactical gloves were stained deep red, his face splattered with the blood of the men he had just slaughtered. He grabbed a heavy iron crowbar from the ground and wedged it into the locking mechanism of the container doors. With a feral, gut-wrenching roar of pure adrenaline and brute strength, he snapped the heavy steel padlock and ripped the massive doors wide open. The interior of the container was pitch black and freezing cold. Vince pulled a tactical flashlight from his belt, the bright beam piercing the darkness. In the far corner, tied to a wooden pallet, was Emma. She was slowly regaining consciousness, her head lolling to the side as the heavy effects of the chloroform began to wear off. She coughed weakly, her wrists bound tightly with thick industrial zip ties. When the bright light hit her face, she flinched, a tiny whimper of terror escaping her lips. The sound completely broke the Ruthless MAFIA boss. Vince dropped the flashlight. He dropped to his knees on the filthy metal floor, completely ignoring the pool of standing water and grime. He pulled a combat knife from his boot and sliced through the thick plastic ties binding her wrists with one swift, careful motion. He threw the blade away as if it burned him, his large, blood-stained hands reaching out to cup her pale face. "Emma," Vince choked out, his voice a raw, shattered whisper that sounded nothing like the cold executioner from seconds ago. "Emma, look at me. It is me. You are safe. I have you." Emma forced her heavy eyelids open. Her vision was blurred, the world spinning in nauseating circles. Slowly, the imposing silhouette in front of her came into focus. She saw the heavy tactical vest, the deadly weapon strapped to his chest, and the fresh blood splattered across his jawline. She looked past his broad shoulders and saw the horrific carnage outside the container doors. Lifeless bodies were scattered across the concrete, surrounded by men in dark combat gear who stood at absolute attention, waiting for a single command from the man kneeling before her. Any normal person would have screamed. Any normal woman would have recoiled in absolute terror, realizing she was married to a mass murderer, a warlord who ruled the criminal underworld. But as Emma looked back into Vince's eyes, she did not see a monster. She saw pure, unadulterated agony. She saw a man who was utterly terrified of losing her. His dark eyes, normally so cold and impenetrable, were entirely filled with tears of desperate relief. His massive hands, which had just dealt death to half a dozen men, were trembling violently as they gently stroked her cheeks. In that brief, crystal-clear moment, the final pieces of the puzzle slammed into place. The mild-mannered information technology worker was a carefully constructed illusion. This terrifying, blood-soaked king of the underworld was her true husband. He had not hesitated to unleash an apocalypse just to pull her from the dark. He had slaughtered a small army simply because they had dared to touch her. A profound, overwhelming sense of clarity washed over Emma, entirely replacing the lingering effects of the drug. For 26 years, the world had abused her, discarded her, and treated her like a worthless pawn. But to this terrifying man, she was the entire universe. He was a demon to the rest of the world, but to her, he was an absolute savior. Emma did not pull away from the blood on his hands. Instead, she pushed herself forward, throwing her arms around his thick, armored neck. Vince let out a shuddering breath, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He wrapped his massive arms tightly around her fragile frame, pulling her flush against his chest as if he was trying to absorb her directly into his soul. He held her with a desperate, crushing intensity, silently praying she would not push him away now that she had finally seen the pitch-black reality of his true nature. "I am here," Emma whispered fiercely, her tears soaking into the collar of his tactical jacket. She pressed her face into his shoulder, breathing in the scent of gunpowder, rain, and dark cedar. "I am right here, Vince. I am not letting you go." Hearing those words, Vince closed his eyes, the final remnants of his humanity tethering themselves permanently to her soul. She had seen the beast, and she had chosen to embrace it. As he picked her up in his arms and carried her out of the rusted container, stepping over the bodies of the men who had tried to steal her away, Emma rested her head against his chest. She looked at the army of syndicate soldiers bowing their heads in deep respect as their boss walked past them. She was no longer a victim. She was the queen of the Salvatore Empire, completely and irrevocably bound to the darkest, most dangerous man in the city. The sterile scent of bleach was completely absent, replaced by the calming aroma of lavender and fresh linen. Emma slowly opened her eyes, finding herself in the sprawling, sunlit suite of the private medical facility exclusively owned by the Salvatore family. Her wrists were carefully bandaged in soft gauze, and the lingering ache in her head had dulled to a quiet hum. She shifted against the high thread count sheets, her gaze immediately seeking the dark, imposing figure that had become her entire world. Vince was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, his broad back facing the bed. He was speaking quietly into an encrypted mobile device. He had not left her side for 48 hours, watching her breathe as if terrified she might suddenly vanish. Hearing the rustle of the heavy blankets, he instantly ended the call and crossed the room, his dark eyes softening the moment they met hers. "How are you feeling?" Vince asked softly, sitting on the edge of the mattress and gently taking her uninjured hand in his. "Safe," Emma whispered, and for the first time in her 26 years of life, the word was absolutely true. Vince pressed a lingering kiss to her forehead. "Rest. I need to speak with my lieutenants in the adjacent wing. I will be right outside the door." Leaving Emma under the protection of 4 heavily armed guards stationed in the corridor, Vince walked into the secure briefing room at the end of the hall. The atmosphere instantly shifted from tender devotion to freezing, absolute authority. 3 of his highest-ranking syndicate commanders were waiting around a mahogany table, along with the chief medical examiner of the Salvatore network. "Report," Vince commanded, taking his seat at the head of the table. His voice held the lethal edge of a blade ready to draw blood. His lead intelligence officer slid a thick, black folder across the polished wood. "Boss, we dug into Martha Hayes just like you ordered. We wanted to know exactly how a low-level gambling addict managed to connect with the high-priced mercenary unit that took your wife. The trail led us directly to Victoria Vance." Vince narrowed his eyes, a dark, murderous storm brewing in his chest. "Victoria funded the abduction?" "Yes," the officer confirmed. "But that is not the most disturbing part. We looked into the connection between Martha and the Vance family. 26 years ago, Martha worked as a low-level domestic maid in the Vance household. She was pregnant at the exact same time as the billionaire wife, Cassandra Vance. Both women went into labor on the exact same night during a massive winter blizzard. They were admitted to the same private maternity ward. Vince went completely still, his brilliant, tactical mind already connecting the horrifying pieces of the puzzle. The relentless abuse. The sheer hatred Martha had always shown Emma. The way Trevor was treated like a king while Emma was treated like a slave. The chief medical examiner stepped forward, opening a separate, sealed envelope. We extracted a blood sample from Emma during her admission for the sedatives. Our operatives also managed to discreetly acquire a DNA sample from Mr. Vance during his business luncheon yesterday afternoon. I ran the sequencing through our private laboratory 3 separate times to ensure absolute accuracy. The room held its collective breath as the medical examiner placed the finalized laboratory report directly in front of the underworld king. The probability of paternity is 99.9%, the doctor stated clearly. Emma is the biological daughter of the billionaire. Victoria Vance is a complete fraud. She is the biological daughter of the maid, Martha Hayes. Martha swapped the infants in the nursery to ensure her own flesh and blood grew up in absolute wealth, while she condemned the true heiress to a life of poverty and abuse. Vince stared at the medical document. The black ink on the white paper felt like a screaming testament to the decades of suffering his wife had been forced to endure. Every tear Emma had ever shed, every extra shift she had worked to pay off debts that were never truly hers, every bruise left on her fragile skin by a family of parasitic strangers. It was all a monstrous, calculated lie. Victoria had unknowingly tried to murder the true owner of the empire she was currently parading around in. A slow, chilling smile spread across Vince's face. It was a smile completely devoid of any warmth, promising a level of destruction that would be written about in the dark corners of the city for decades. He closed the folder, his large hands resting flat against the table. The Vance family is hosting their annual charity gala this Saturday, Vince noted, his voice dropping to a deadly, quiet frequency. Victoria intends to use the event to publicly announce our supposed engagement to the media. "What are your orders, boss?" the lead lieutenant asked, ready to mobilize the entire Shadow Army. "Let her plan her grand party," Vince commanded, standing up from the table. "Let her invite the press, the elite, and the politicians. We are going to attend. I am going to dress my wife in diamonds, and we are going to walk through the front doors of that ballroom. Victoria wants the attention of the world. I am going to give it to her right before I strip away every single thing she thinks she owns." Vince turned and walked back toward the medical suite. He was not just going to protect Emma anymore. He was going to place a crown upon her head, and he would force the entire city to drop to their knees and worship the true queen. The grand ballroom of the Vance estate was a blinding display of excessive wealth and untouchable privilege. Crystal chandeliers the size of small vehicles cast a warm, golden glow over hundreds of the city elite. Waiters wearing crisp white uniforms wove seamlessly through the dense crowd of politicians, business moguls, and high society socialites, carrying heavy silver trays loaded with vintage champagne and expensive caviar. At the very center of the opulent room stood Victoria Vance, wearing a custom silk gown that cost more money than most people would earn in a decade. She was surrounded by a thick swarm of eager reporters and flashing cameras. Basking in the absolute adoration of the upper class, she believed she ruled by divine right. She smiled radiantly for the press, her voice carrying effortlessly over the elegant classical music playing softly in the background. "Yes, the rumors are entirely true," Victoria announced, flashing her perfectly white teeth for the cameras. "Tonight is not just about charity. It is a celebration of a historic union between two of the most powerful families in the country. The chief executive officer of Obsidian Corporation will be arriving shortly to make our engagement official. Our families have planned this for years, and I am absolutely thrilled to step into my role as his wife." She believed her victory was absolute and permanent. In her arrogant mind, Emma Hayes was currently locked in a lightless shipping container halfway across the Atlantic Ocean, destined for a life of unspeakable horrors, never to be seen or heard from again. Victoria felt completely untouchable. Outside the massive wrought iron gates of the estate, a sleek, bulletproof luxury vehicle glided to a silent, heavy halt. Inside the secure cabin, Emma took a deep, steadying breath. She was wearing a breathtaking midnight blue velvet gown, tailored to absolute perfection, with a diamond necklace resting against her collarbone that was worth more than the entire gala itself. She looked like absolute royalty. But the true source of her newfound strength was not the expensive fabric or the heavy jewels. It was the terrifying, beautiful certainty that the most dangerous man in the world was standing right beside her. Vince sat next to her, dressed in a flawless, midnight black tuxedo that somehow made his massive, muscular frame look even more imposing and lethal. He reached over, his large hand gently covering hers. "Are you ready, my queen?" he asked softly, his dark eyes burning with a fierce, protective devotion. "I am," Emma replied, her voice remarkably steady. "Let us finish this." Vince had instructed her to enter the grand foyer first, a highly calculated tactical move designed to draw Victoria true venom before the trap was fully sprung. He would be just a few steps behind her in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Emma stepped out of the vehicle and walked up the sweeping marble steps leading to the main entrance. The heavy mahogany doors were held open by stunned uniformed staff. As she stepped into the breathtaking foyer, the sparkling lights caught the flawless diamonds at her throat. Inside the ballroom, a security chief leaned in and whispered frantically into Victoria's ear, informing her that the marketing assistant from Obsidian Corporation had somehow breached the perimeter and was standing in the front lobby. Victoria's eyes widened in a brief flash of panic, but it was immediately swallowed by a vicious, toxic arrogance. She did not know how the pathetic peasant had escaped the docks, but it did not matter. Emma was standing in Victoria territory now, completely alone and entirely out of her depth. This was the perfect opportunity to publicly destroy her in front of the entire upper class. "Hold the press here," Victoria commanded her publicist. She signaled for 6 massive private security guards to follow her immediately. Victoria marched out into the grand foyer, her face twisted into a mask of pure, condescending disgust. She stopped a few feet away from Emma, folding her arms across her chest. A crowd of wealthy guests and minor socialites naturally gravitated toward the commotion, their eyes wide with hungry curiosity as they formed a tight circle around the two women. "Well, this is absolutely pathetic," Victoria sneered, her shrill voice echoing loudly off the marble walls, intentionally drawing as much attention as possible to maximize the humiliation. "I honestly did not think a rat could swim this far. How exactly did you sneak past the service entrance, Emma? Are you here to beg for your miserable job back, or are you just looking for a wealthy man to scam now that your tech support husband finally realized what a worthless gold digger you are?" The surrounding guests began to whisper, casting openly judgmental glares at Emma. The 6 massive security guards stepped forward, forming a physical wall of intimidation, ready to drag Emma out by her hair at a single nod from the heiress. "You do not belong here, Emma," Victoria continued, taking a step closer, her eyes blazing with absolute hatred and superiority. "Did you really think a cheap rented dress and fake glass stones would fool anyone in this room? You are nothing but a desperate parasite trying to pretend you are anything more than filthy, lower-class trash. You're a stain on my floor. Guards, grab this pathetic beggar and throw her out into the street where she belongs." The guards lunged forward, their heavy hands reaching out to grab Emma's bare shoulders. Emma did not flinch. She did not take a single step backward. She stood perfectly still, her chin raised high, her eyes locking onto Victoria with a calm, pitying grace that completely unnerved the arrogant heiress. Emma knew she did not have to defend herself or run away in tears like she would have done in the past. The beast lurking in the shadows was already unchained, and the countdown to Victoria's absolute destruction had officially reached 0. Before the heavy hands of the private security guards could even graze the velvet fabric of Emma's gown, a voice like shattering ice echoed through the grand marble foyer. "If any of you touch my wife, I will personally ensure you never use your hands again." The 6 massive guards froze instantly, the blood draining from their faces as an overwhelming, suffocating aura of lethal authority flooded the room. The crowd of wealthy elites parted in absolute terror, gasping in collective shock as Vincent Salvatore stepped out from the shadows. He was no longer the quiet, unassuming technician hidden in the basement of Obsidian Corporation. Dressed in a flawless, midnight black tuxedo expertly tailored in Italy, Vince radiated the terrifying, absolute power of a king stepping onto his throne. Every single step he took against the marble floor echoed with the weight of an apex predator. His dark, obsidian eyes locked onto Victoria, burning with a cold, apocalyptic fury that made the arrogant heiress physically stumble backward in sheer panic. Victoria's mouth opened and closed in a desperate, silent scramble for words. She recognized the terrifying crust of the Salvatore syndicate pinned subtly to his lapel. She recognized the face of the billionaire chief executive officer she had been trying to marry for years. But her mind violently malfunctioned as she watched this god of the criminal and corporate world walk directly past her without a single glance of recognition or respect. Vince stopped directly in front of Emma. His lethal expression softened into absolute, unyielding devotion as he gently took her hand, lifting it to press a reverent kiss against her knuckles. He turned to face the stunned crowd, intertwining his fingers with hers, an unspoken vow of eternal protection broadcast to the entire city. "Follow me," Vince commanded, his voice a low rumble that left absolutely no room for hesitation. He led Emma past the trembling guards and the paralyzed heiress, walking straight through the towering double doors and into the grand ballroom. The hundreds of politicians, business moguls, and high society socialites fell into a dead, terrified silence. The elegant classical music abruptly stopped as the conductor dropped his baton. Every single eye in the opulent room tracked the terrifying mafia boss as he escorted the woman Victoria had just called a peasant directly up to the main stage. Vince stepped up to the crystal podium, adjusting the microphone with one large, scarred hand while keeping his other arm firmly wrapped around Emma's waist, pulling her flush against his side. "Good evening," Vince announced. His voice reverberated through the massive speakers, vibrating in the chest of every single person in the room. "For those who do not know my face, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Vincent Salvatore. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Obsidian Corporation, and I am the undisputed head of the Salvatore family." A collective gasp rippled through the sea of elite guests. The mythical, terrifying underworld king was standing right in front of them, bathing in the chandelier light. "Victoria Vance invited the press here tonight to announce an engagement," Vince continued, his gaze finding the trembling heiress who had just stumbled into the ballroom, her face pale as a sheet. "There is an engagement, but it is certainly not to her. I am already a married man. The woman standing beside me, Emma Salvatore, is my lawful wife and the only queen of my empire." The blinding flash of dozens of press cameras erupted in a chaotic frenzy, capturing the shocking declaration. Victoria shook her head frantically, tears of absolute humiliation and panic ruining her expensive makeup. She tried to step forward, desperate to salvage her crumbling, pathetic reality. "That is a lie," Victoria shrieked hysterically, pointing a trembling finger at Emma. "She is a fraud. She is a criminal." Vince let out a dark, chilling laugh that offered absolutely no warmth. "A criminal. That is a very interesting choice of words, Victoria." Vince reached into the interior pocket of his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a sleek, encrypted mobile device. He synced it to the ballroom massive audio system with a single tap of his thumb. "Let us talk about criminals. Let us talk about what happens when a spoiled, delusional parasite decides to hire a syndicate of human traffickers to abduct my wife." He pressed a button on the illuminated screen. Instantly, the crystal-clear audio recording of Victoria's voice blasted through the ballroom speakers at maximum volume. "I want her gone," the recorded voice of Victoria hissed with venomous cruelty. "Place her on an untraceable cargo ship bound for a lawless foreign port, and ensure she never steps foot on American soil again. Here is the $500,000. The entire ballroom erupted in horrified gasps and terrified murmurs. The wealthy guests physically recoiled from Victoria, looking at her as if she were a rabid animal covered in plague. The press cameras immediately swiveled away from the stage and targeted the disgraced heiress, their blinding flashes trapping her as journalists shouted frantic questions about human trafficking and attempted murder. Victoria collapsed onto her knees, covering her ears with her shaking hands, completely destroyed by the irrefutable evidence of her own monstrous crimes echoing around her. The velvet cage she had tried to build for Emma had just slammed shut around her own neck, locking her away forever. Emma stood tall beside the most dangerous man in the city, feeling the solid, immovable warmth of his body against hers. A profound sense of vindication rushed through her veins. For 26 years, she had been told she was worthless, a burden meant to be used and discarded. Yet here she was, standing on the highest pedestal of high society, while the woman who had tormented her was sobbing on the marble floor in utter disgrace. The sound of approaching police sirens began to wail in the distance, growing louder with every passing second. Vince had ensured the local authorities received the unedited audio files exactly 5 minutes before he stepped onto the stage. He was not just destroying Victoria's reputation. He was sending her to a federal penitentiary for the rest of her miserable life. "You are nothing but a monster," Victoria sobbed, looking up at Vince with wild, bloodshot eyes. Vince stared down at her with absolute, terrifying apathy. "I am the devil you invited into your home, and I am simply collecting my dears." He turned his attention away from the ruined heiress, dismissing her existence entirely. He looked down at Emma, the freezing coldness in his eyes melting away to reveal a burning, eternal devotion. He had promised to burn the world to keep her safe, and the ashes of her enemies were currently falling all around them. The wailing of police sirens pierced the cold night air, growing louder until the flashing red and blue lights illuminated the towering stained glass windows of the grand ballroom. But Vincent Salvatore was not finished. He raised his hand, signaling his lead intelligence officer, who stepped forward from the shadows carrying a thick, black leather folder. Vince took the folder and walked directly toward the host of the evening, the billionaire patriarch, Derek Vance. Derek stood paralyzed, his eyes darting between the sobbing Victoria on the floor and the terrifying mafia boss standing before him. Vince handed the heavy folder to the older man. "You have spent your entire life pouring your love and fortune into a lie, Mr. Vance," Vince stated, his voice ringing with absolute, undeniable authority. 26 years ago, a maid named Martha Hayes gave birth in the same hospital as your late wife. Driven by greed, Martha swapped her own child with yours. The woman crying on your floor is a fraud. The woman standing beside me, my wife, is your true biological daughter. Derek Vance's hands shook violently as he opened the folder. He stared at the certified medical documents, the detailed investigation reports, and the DNA sequencing results that confirmed the truth with a 99.9% certainty. The billionaire dropped the folder. He looked at Victoria, seeing the cruel, manipulative features of the maid he had fired decades ago, and then he looked at Emma. He saw the exact shape of his late wife's eyes, the gentle curve of her face, and the quiet, enduring strength she carried. Tears spilled over the old man-weathered cheeks. He took a hesitant, trembling step toward Emma, his arms opening in a silent plea for forgiveness. For a moment, Emma stood still, the overwhelming weight of her true identity crashing over her. She looked at Vince, who gave her a single, reassuring nod. Emma stepped forward, allowing her real father to embrace her for the first time in 26 years. At that exact moment, heavily armed police officers stormed into the ballroom. They bypassed the stunned wealthy guests and headed straight for Victoria. The disgraced heiress screamed and thrashed wildly as cold steel handcuffs were locked tightly around her wrists, dragging her away to face decades in a federal penitentiary for conspiracy and attempted human trafficking. Justice did not stop at the ballroom doors. Across the city, the Salvatore Syndicate had completely dismantled the lives of those who had tortured their queen. Kyle Preston sat in a freezing holding cell, stripped of his corporate titles and facing a lifetime behind bars for corporate espionage. Martha and Trevor Hayes were hunted down by federal agents acting on anonymous tips provided by Vince Network, their miserable lives of gambling and extortion ending in cold, windowless interrogation rooms with absolutely no hope of escape. The storm had finally passed. The ballroom slowly emptied as the police cleared the area, leaving only the shattered remnants of Victoria Falls Kingdom. Vince walked over to Emma, pulling her gently away from her father's emotional embrace. He wrapped his strong arms around her waist, drawing her flush against his chest. The entire world had shifted on its axis tonight, but the only thing that mattered to Emma was the steady, comforting beat of her husband's heart. "You are safe now, my queen," Vince whispered, his dark eyes shining with an eternal, unbreakable vow. "No one will ever hurt you again." Emma smiled, a radiant, breathtaking expression of pure joy that completely erased decades of sorrow. She reached up, weaving her fingers into his dark hair, and pulled him down for a deep, passionate kiss. It was a triumphant seal on their victory, a beautiful collision of light and darkness. The Cinderella of the slums had not just found her prince, she had claimed the most dangerous king in the world, opening the doors to a spectacular new life built on absolute power and an undeniable, earth-shattering love. This concludes the epic tale of Emma and Vince. This story leaves us with a profound life lesson and deep human values. It teaches us that true worth is never defined by the clothes we wear, the money in our pockets, or the cruel labels society tries to force upon us. True value lies in the resilience of our spirit and the purity of our hearts. It reminds us that light can be found in the darkest of places, and that true love is about protecting, uplifting, and standing by someone when the entire world turns against them. Deceit and cruelty may wear a crown for a short time, but truth and justice will always reclaim the throne. Please hit the subscribe button, like, and share this video to listen to more captivating and thrilling stories every single day. How did this story make you feel? Can you relate any part of Emma's journey to the struggles or triumphs in your own real life? Please share your thoughts in the comments section below. We truly want to listen to the feelings that come from deep within your heart. Wishing everyone watching this video robust health, a joyful life every single day, and profound inner peace. Goodbye and see you in the next video.